horrible yellow eyes.
Every great hero needs a great villain, and the Green Goblin is one of Spider-Man's greatest. While the character's comic origin dates back to 1964, many consider the version played by Willem Dafoe in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man to be definitive, so much that he returns almost 20 years later. But what makes the character of Norman Osborn and the way Dafoe plays him so memorable and iconic?
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
And how did he and Raimi create an antagonist who not only makes for a perfect thematic foil to Peter Parker, but one who's both goofy and terrifying, sometimes all at once? Good old Gobby started out as one of Spider-Man's wackier foes. In his very first appearance, he rides a mechanical broomstick and tries to convince Spider-Man to co-star with him in a knockoff of the creature from the Black Lagoon. You can see a resemblance between the scales on the original Goblin outfit and the design of the classic Universal monster, and the character's all-green mechanical suit in the movie looks pretty similar as well. So, the character was ridiculous in his early days, but less than a decade after his debut, the Green Goblin would go on to cause one of the darkest turns in superhero comics: the death of Gwen Stacy, at a time when killing off beloved characters in brutal fashion was far from a common occurrence. Given the character's dynamic history, one that's both quirky and macabre, and the horror comedy tone that Evil Dead trilogy director Sam Raimi brought to the franchise, the Green Goblin was the perfect fit on paper. In fact, before Raimi joined the project, Osborn was the film's co-villain alongside Doc Ock, who was eventually saved for the sequel. And before that version, James Cameron's original draft didn't feature the Goblin at all, but focused on Sandman and Electro. However, the Goblin gave Raimi the opportunity to not only tap into some of his horror movie instincts, but to tell a story loaded with thematic meaning.
Don't ever be ashamed of who you are.
I'm not ashamed of who I am.
About fathers and sons.
Join me, and I will complete your training.
Join me. Imagine what we could accomplish together.
About the way technology was changing the world, and of course about
great power
and
great responsibility.
The first Spider-Man film is steeped in nostalgia, from the way it evokes Richard Donner's Superman, to the broad, sincere, early soap opera performances by Rosemary Harris and Cliff Robertson as the kindly Aunt May and Uncle Ben, whose quaint little home feels preserved in amber and like it belongs to an earlier era. Like any elderly couple, their home is filled with old-world decor, and their tech is all out of date. Uncle Ben even drives Sam Raimi's Oldsmobile Delta 88 from 1973. Modern technology has grown so far beyond them that it's leaving them behind.
Computer salesman, computer engineer, computer analyst. My lord, even the computers need analysts these days.
The movie came out in 2002, shortly after the dot-com bubble and Y2K. It's set in an increasingly technological world with technological problems, and a technological villain to contrast Spider-Man's organic powers, including his natural webbing, unlike the mechanical web shooters seen in most other versions. It's also worth noting that Peter's pursuit of the technological and the material is part of the domino effect that gets Uncle Ben killed. The whole reason he tries to earn money at the wrestling show where he lets Ben's eventual killer escape is so that he can buy a car to impress Mary Jane. And what is Oscorp CEO Norman Osborn if not an embodiment of the technological and the material? Not only does Norman represent the ruthless forward march of industry, he also reflects the way money and power can lead to a warped sense of exceptionalism.
Teeming masses exist for the sole purpose of lifting the few exceptional people onto their shoulders.
However, the good people of New York eventually prove him wrong and fight for their working class hero the way he fights for them.
You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us!
This gets right to the heart of the film's dynamic between power and responsibility, because what separates the Goblin and Spider-Man is the choices they make and how they use their power. They both give into it at first, but where Peter reins himself in and uses his powers for good, Norman, well... Of course, these are just the broad strokes that frame both characters, and the way any well-written villain should contrast thematically with their hero. But what takes Osborn from good to great is the actor playing him, and the way he navigates not only a complicated story of fatherhood, but one that demands relatable humanity from an over-the-top, scenery-chewing villain who feels straight out of a 60s comic book.
No one says no to me!
The amazing thing about the Green Goblin is that while he's delightfully, whimsically evil, he's also a deeply tragic and sympathetic figure. He and his son Harry have a distant relationship. In fact, Norman finds it easier to relate to Peter than he does to Harry. And he has plenty of his own problems too. When the story begins, the US military threatens to pull the funding for his research, so he's forced to experiment on himself. Dafoe is no stranger to tragedy. There's an intense musical quality to several of his performances, and he plays Osborn's final moments of sanity with a graceful, lyrical physicality of an opera performer or a Renaissance artwork come to life. Like God creating man, this is the moment man creates something worse. And speaking of the Renaissance, if you're going to create religious imagery reminiscent of Andrea Mantegna's Lamentation of the Christ, you may as well cast a guy who's familiar with that specific tragic territory. But in addition to the tragic figure that is Norman Osborn, you also have to cast someone who knows how to play the other side of the character. Someone wrapped up in their own allure, like Max Schreck's method performance on the set of Nosferatu. So they really did find the exact right guy. Norman starts out as a stern father, if a slightly oblivious one, while also feeling slighted by the powers that be. But once he becomes the Goblin, it's off to the races, as Raimi switches all the way into Evil Dead mode for Norman throughout the rest of the film. When he first becomes the Green Goblin, Dafoe's body language immediately takes on an animalistic appearance. It makes for a great visual parallel to Spider-Man, but his crouch is also specific in a way that makes him a perfect fit for the Oscorp glider, like it was something he was meant to pilot. The Goblin and Norman personas start out at least slightly at odds, with the villainous alter ego taunting Norman from the outside. But shortly thereafter, we get to see Dafoe dive into the deep end as he switches between the two, sometimes in the same shot. Dafoe's body language alternates between Norman's cowering stiffness and the Goblin's smooth, cougar-like saunter, like he's trying to seduce Norman, while his expression transitions seamlessly from confusion and desperation to the maniacal frozen grin seen on his mask. As the film goes on, the two personas draw closer and closer together. At first, Dafoe oscillates wildly between a wounded animal and a raging lunatic.
You know how much I sacrificed?
But the more he gets caught up in his own power, the more indignant he becomes, with silent stares that are scarier than anything he could possibly shout. While you could argue that the Goblin is an entirely separate identity that begins to consume him, it's also not a stretch to say that it brings out his worst impulses, like his behavior towards Mary Jane.
Do what you need to with her, then broom her fast.
This plays further into the film's themes of fatherhood, since Norman begins to reflect MJ's own abusive dynamic at home, a driving force behind her dreams of stardom and her desire to escape.
You're trash. You're always gonna be trash, just like her.
I have to go to school.
Who's stop?
How much of this behavior is Norman and how much is the Goblin is a lingering question that the movie never answers, but it's one that Dafoe's performance places front and center, and he never forgets to have fun while he's doing it. In one moment, he's hamming it up like a mustache-twirling villain from a silent classic, but in the next, he portrays a devastating internal conflict when he realizes that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Soon after, he struggles while giving all the way into his darker side, kneeling and submitting to the Goblin persona, putting his humanity on full display before he finally buries it. The Green Goblin is powerful, terrifying, and oh so silly. But in the end, during his climactic battle with Peter, he brings all the movie's themes together in a dramatic high point.
I beg you, protect me.
At first, he uses fatherhood as a weapon in order to distract Peter.
I've been like a father to you.
And while he might sound sincere, his face is uncanny, because he's lit from below like a classic Universal monster.
Oh.
But when Norman's own technology becomes his undoing, his agonizing death leads to a brief and touching moment of sincerity, where his heartbreaking final words are about protecting his son from the ugly truth of what he became.
Don't tell Harry.
A performance that runs the gamut from desperate to explosive to cartoonishly devious, Dafoe throws everything at the wall, and pretty much all of it sticks. From his sickly cackle to the way his lines are dripping with mocking sarcasm.
Well, to each his own.
Every Spider-Man since the original has tried to follow in its footsteps in some way, whether by repurposing its villains or by trying to recreate its themes.
With great power comes
Don't
great...
you dare finish that sentence.
Responsibility.
Crap.
backpack's gone.
It doesn't sound responsible.
But few of their characters were as perfectly matched for the idea in the way that Uncle Ben originally meant it.
These are the years when a man changes into the man he's going to become the rest of his life. Just be careful who you change into.